Thank you, Tena. I think that we can then go. So Kennet, Lynggaard, Mats, Dagnis Jensen, and Michael Kluth will, as editors, present the government's responses to the COVID pandemic in Europe, navigating the perfect storm. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. And thanks very much for setting this up. We've been very much looking forward to this. We're so pleased that the book is finally out. This is how it looks like in physical form. Looks good, we think. Yeah, for the past year and a half, there's been a lot of bookkeeping, spreadsheets, making sure that everything is coming in and sending it back with the comments and all that. So it's really, we're very pleased that it's out. And we're gonna say a few words, each of us. I will start. My name is Kennet Lynggaard. I'll start to say a few words about the book. Then Mikael will go on to say a few words about sort of which is the basic organizing principle of the book. We've set up a few groupings, and he'll focus on the Eastern grouping, and then Mads will end up by saying a few of the comparative conclusions. So the next one, Mikael, is that you or? Okay, yeah, thanks a lot. So actually just very briefly about how this book, how we came up with the idea, which is, I guess the idea is pretty obvious, straightforward. We met up at a cafe at the Christianshavn in Copenhagen, Mikael, Mads and I, on the day which went into history as the first reopening. We didn't know that it was Monday evening, so we went out. We met up for a drink, and of course we talked about all sorts of things, but also a lot about COVID-19. And then at some point in our talk, the idea came up that why don't we make a book where we compare all European countries? And then like 10 minutes later, we had sort of a rough sketch. And I guess about 6 weeks later, we also had authors on almost all of 31 countries. And we were very impressed by it, really, because almost everybody we wrote would come back with some variation of, oh, I'm quite busy right now, but sure, I'll do that. Can I bring on a colleague of mine? So that was really very impressive, we thought. But I think it's also, very closely related to that. I think we all know as a social scientist that this was just too important not to deal with in some way or other. So and thank you for all of you who's contributed to it, who's here today. What is the basic research questions of the book is that we want to look into the responses of different of the governments to the COVID-19 and compare it to normal policy making. We looked into, as I said, 31 countries, which is EU 27, plus Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, and the UK. And there's in the book, there's an in-depth chapter on each of these 31 countries. And then there is also a comparative or an experts survey, which goes across each of the chapters where all the contributors have filled in or answered a survey, which was far too extensive, we know, but it was very helpful to write up the actual conclusion. So just a few words about the basic sort of key analytical dimension of the book. So each of the chapters, this is how each of the chapters are organized by looking into patterns of governance, politicization versus depoliticization, and policy responses. Patterns of governance look into the actors and institutions involved in the responses to the pandemic. That includes also how it was coordinated. It was a kind of a command and control, or was it more network-based kind of responses in each of the countries, and also about the authority associated with the politics surrounding COVID-19, whether it was very centralized or decentralized, or locally, and so on. So what the questions associated with that dimension is, were there some actors which was empowered and some who were disempowered? What was the relationship between the government and the parliament and the courts and the regions? What was the influence, if any, of international institutions or organizations like the EU and the WHO in shaping the process? The politicization and depoliticization, this is something that we saw in many countries to various extent. Mads will say something more systematic about this later on, but we saw in many countries at least periods of depoliticization, and maybe in particular in the first stages of the pandemic. So this is about, whether there was politics surrounding this, and political conflicts, or it was kind of the issue was moved into the sphere of necessity. We have to do this, and not much discussion and so on. So this is about how the government reacted and parliament reacted. What was the role of courts, or the proactive, reactive, in evaluating or perhaps even overturning government policies, as we've seen in some countries? What was the role of different political parties, both in government, outside government, public opinion, the administration, and expertise? Obviously, expertise was a major thing in very many countries. The role of social groups. There were protests in many countries, interest groups. How did they try to influence, and what kind of influence did they have? And then the last dimension is policy responses. How did various countries actually respond? With what type of policies? And we compare, containment and closure policies with economic policies, economic stimuli, and so on, and health system policies. So what kind of instruments was used? Was there any changes over time in each of the countries during the pandemic? And what was the scope of invasiveness of these policies? Yeah.
Yes, well, thank you, Kennet. I will just take it from here, because we decided that it would be useful with some sort of overarching structure, given the large amount of case studies. And we did a survey of the COVID-19 government response literature as it looked about half a year ago. Of course, it has since grown significantly. And it sort of suggested that there were two sets of independent variables which could help us explain the variations in responses to the pandemic. And the first broad set would be historically conditioned factors such as affluence, redistributional legacies, and the fundamental entrenchment of democratic institutions. So that would be the more sort of longue durée set of variables. But there would also be a number of more contemporary variables, such as what would be the dominant mode of governance prior to the pandemic, what would be patterns of politicization in different countries. There would be variables about leadership attributes and the balance of power between the various actors and different levels of government. Of course, these overlap and are highly interconnected, but we nonetheless endeavored to pursue a two-pronged approach, where we first aspire to sort of explore the differences in the more contemporary politics variables and assess the impact of these on the variations. And secondly, we would examine how the above variables and response patterns, how they aligned to groupings of countries made on the basis of the more historically conditioned factors. And that led us to the creation of the four categories: the northern, western, southern, and eastern groupings. And today, of course, we are looking at the southeastern grouping, which here would be represented with the book's eastern grouping. And the common denominator here would be that these are countries which have fairly recently made a very profound transition from planned economy to a more liberal market economy with all the liberal polity trappings. And this have, of course, somewhat diminished the institutional entrenchment of democracy, and this is something that has been reflected in very prominent examples of backsliding. And if we take the economic intelligence unit, the countries that we grouped in the Eastern grouping would score 7.05 in the democracy index, and many of the countries also are characterized by rather modest public trust in government institutions. On top of that, the countries as a common denominator would have sort of intermediate to low levels of affluence. There is actually quite a bit of variation in the Eastern grouping, but on average, they would be below the Southern grouping. But again, there are quite a few deviations, including for some of the countries we will be dealing with today. So Slovenia is pretty much on par with the Southern grouping, and all the members half the members of the Eastern grouping actually exceed, for example, Greece, which we placed in the Southern grouping. Then we had the welfare state literature, where there is sort of many attempts to create a post-communist welfare model. If we are sort of in the worlds of welfare state capitalism, and it's a bit frustrating, this particular literature, because on the one hand there seems to be some agreement that it makes sense to speak of a distinct group which would capture the Eastern grouping, because collectively they seem to be distinct from the other established categories in the comparative welfare state literature, but there's also considerable internal variation. And given the group of countries we'll be looking at today, we can see that Slovenia is actually one of the members of the Eastern groupings with the most with the largest level of welfare spending, but it's still below, for example, Italy. But this is only one aspect, naturally. So, did these features somehow reflect in how the countries responded to the corona pandemic? It did, but perhaps not as solidly as we anticipated, and this is something that Mads will return to in a moment. But generally speaking, we perhaps didn't see quite as strong a reflection in the use of authority and modality due to the absence of well-entrenched democratic institutions. But we did see a pattern, but perhaps not as prominently as we expected when compared to some of the other groupings. And it was not that the organizational shortcomings in some of the welfare state services came across that solidly in our findings, and there was perhaps an aspect of treasurer being used fairly liberally, basically because many of the Eastern countries would have relatively healthy public finances. But just to sort of wrap it up, some of the preliminary conclusions showed that actually only Slovenia refrained from declaring a state of emergency. Well, Poland did too in the Eastern grouping, but of the countries we looked at today, that might be attributed to so the overwhelming support for declaring a state of emergency might be an attribution of the fairly weak entrenchment of democracy, but of course that's debatable. There were some interesting individual stories, including how Slovenia's crisis management approach was actually tangled up with a contemporary government project about a very profound institutional change of the country. Bulgaria, Croatia, and Romania very much struggled with implementation of policy, and they encountered all sorts of difficulties with coordination. But Romania actually maintained a low level of politicalization. But there's no reason for me to continue here, because Mads has the more overarching comparative conclusions, and the more interesting insights on the countries will, of course, be presented shortly by the authors.
Thank you very much for this introduction, Michael. As Kennet already said, we did a survey among all the authors to draw up the comparative conclusions on the 3 dimensions that we're looking at. We only find a clear Eastern European clustering with regard to policy responses. On the 2 other dimensions, it's too heterogeneous that we can talk about an East European cluster. So I'll talk about the general pattern that we find in the data on 2 of the dimensions, and then I'll talk about the particular Eastern European clustering that we find on the last dimension. And if we first look at patterns of governance, then we can see, in line with the literature, that governments are stepping up slightly during the pandemic, and that the parliaments and the courts are giving the governments the space that they need to cope with the pandemic. But what is perhaps more interesting, and what is not surprising, is that experts they are really being involved and stepping up here. Okay, I just got a message. Yeah, so experts are stepping up in terms of coping with the pandemic. The public administrations are also stepping up, and regions are also increasing their role in dealing with the pandemic, because this is of a multi-level nature. But on this dimension, we don't see a clear Eastern European cluster. We see them belonging to many of the different clusters when we start to fill them in to the geographical model. Next slide, Michael. It's still on the same slide for me. Oh. Then the second dimension is on the level of politicization, and again, we don't find a clear level, a clear pattern, East European pattern in terms of the level of politicization. So I'll more talk about the general pattern that we see across all 31 countries that we examined, and we see that there's a level of depoliticization in the different phases. So opposition parties are less critical of the government, especially during the first lockdown. Then the level of politicization increases during the subsequent phases, but there's still a much lower level of politicization during the pandemic. And this is in line with other studies that we have of the pandemic, where we see this rally around the flag effect in the political systems, where other actors are giving the governments the necessary space to cope with the pandemic. And then the final slide, where we look at policy responses. In terms of policy responses, we do see somewhat of a East European clustering when we measure it in terms of policy efficacy. So on the right side, we have clustered them according to the different geographical groupings that we have in the book. And then on the left side, we have the clustering according to political efficacy. And then we see here that most of the Eastern European countries score lower on policy efficacy, political efficacy in terms of coping with the crisis, as compared to the Western and the Northern European clusters, with a few exceptions being Bulgaria and Hungary and so on. But on the whole of it, we don't see clear clustering in terms of Eastern Europe. There's a high degree of heterogeneity in this group examined along the 3 dimensions. That's it for me.
Okay, so perhaps we can now start with the presentation of the various countries. I think the first one in line is Dimiter Toshkov, who will tell us about his chapter on Bulgaria.
All right, thank you very much. I hope you can see and hear me. My connection is very unstable, so I apologize in advance if it at some point doesn't work, but I'll try to share my screen and start the presentation right now, okay? I think the presentation should be loading right now and should be visible. I can use the time before that to thank the organizer for this event. Of course, COVID is not as salient as it was when we were working on the book, but I'm glad to see that there is still some interest because I think also the pandemic responses to COVID hold broader lessons about governance in Central and Eastern Europe. So maybe we can learn something from COVID to improve governance and public policy making in these countries more generally. So the presentation is still loading. I hope it's going to be done in a few seconds. Okay, I hope you can now see the title slide. I'm going to talk about the Bulgarian experience. And I have to say, I'm not sure to what extent it fits into the general Eastern European pattern. What I want to emphasize is that this is a story that has three very different phases. And this was not something that the editors mentioned, but I think there's a lot of variety of how countries reacted to the pandemic and with what success, depending on where in the pandemic we're looking at. So basically the story about COVID governance in Bulgaria is a story in three very different acts, in three very different parts. And to summarize, in the very beginning, during the first wave, there was quite a bit of success. Surprising maybe, but definitely policy success. Then the second part, which is roughly between the end of summer 2020 and March, April 2021, there was increasing chaos. So the government tried to contain a pandemic that was much more severe than in the beginning, with only partial success, but there were efforts and there was chaos, but there was nevertheless some policy response. And then after March, April 2021, the governments completely let down. So they threw in the towel, they imposed some measures that themselves they didn't want to implement, the public didn't comply. So altogether we had a complete, almost complete meltdown of governance, of public response to the pandemic. And then the question is, why do we see this pattern? So in the next few minutes, I'm going to expand a bit on the developments and also offer some tentative suggestions about what could explain these patterns. So let's start with the first part, which at least I see as pretty much as a success story. But then, of course, was it success because of prudence or capacity, or was it success simply because the country happened to be lucky? So it was just a coincidence that the country responded so well. Why do I say that it responded well? Because basically it reacted very fast, swiftly, and decisively. It closed down schools very soon after the first cases appeared. It adopted emergency measures, which streamlined the response of the government. It imposed a lockdown. The population was fairly compliant. People were scared, so they stayed at home. They didn't complain too much. The parliament didn't get involved. They supported the government measures. And then by and large, by the end of the summer, the country was pretty much unscarred. So there were not a lot of hospitalizations. There were not a lot of deaths. There were not a lot of cases. So we can claim that it was not at least too bad. Then the question is why? Was it just luck? I mean, first of all, of course, Bulgaria and many of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, they are not at the centers of population movement on a global scale. So of course you have tourism in these countries, summer as well as winter, you have some population, some labor movements as well, but it's incomparable to what goes on in London or Paris or some of these big hubs where millions of people meet from all parts of the world every day. So maybe these countries are just relatively isolated, so they could watch what happens in Italy, what happens in the UK, and then react after that. I think there is some truth to that. Particularly in Bulgaria, what was also lucky was that the schools were already closed because of a flu epidemic. And then you can see that just as a coincidence, or you can see it as a more systematic factor, because at least in Bulgaria, but also in some of the other Eastern European countries, there is kind of a traditional legacy of the Ministry of Health being pretty, not shying away from closing down schools in the face of big flu epidemics. So I think this legacy helped for a swift reaction in the case of COVID as well. Then some more systematic factors. Well, in this country, and I think in many others in Central and Eastern Europe, there is also a legacy of fairly strong and independent health ministries. And then, as we show in some other research, this is a factor that is systematically related to the speed of the policy response. Another factor that is systematically related is the fact that the minister is actually a medical doctor. So when you have medical doctors as ministers, these were more likely to put the issue on the government agenda early in the pandemic and to negotiate a fast response. This was also the case in Bulgaria. So there are some factors that speak about the influence of luck and some factors that speak about more systematic influences. Overall, the pattern in Europe in the first wave was governments with more limited capacity. Quite curiously, also when we look at particularly pandemic preparedness, so the countries who scored higher on pandemic preparedness, they were the slower to react, which led to higher number of cases and more death. So this is not in the book chapter, but to give you some context, this shows basically the speed of the policy response in relation to the number of cases that were confirmed at the date of locking down societies and closing down the schools in particular in this graph. So what it shows is that the countries that had more cases were, well, it shows that the Western European countries, the UK, Spain, France, Italy, Germany, they were much slower to close down schools in relation to where they were in the pandemic. It's a pretty strong pattern. You can see Bulgaria in the lower left, which means that there were fewer cases when the country closed down the schools. And then just one more graph. This shows government effectiveness on the x-axis versus the number of cases when the countries imposed lockdowns. So overall, it's a kind of a measure of the quality and the speed of the response on the y-axis versus general government effectiveness as measured by the World Bank on the x-axis. And then the relationship, maybe surprisingly, it's positive, meaning that the more effective the countries in general, the more capacity their governments have, the slower they responded. And at least during the first wave, this was not the right choice. Again, we can speculate why this is the case, but at least my interpretation is when you have low capacity, you know you cannot take chances, so you're very fast to close down. When you think you have a lot of capacity, you hesitate, and that proved not very beneficial during the first wave. So that's about the first wave. The second wave was very different, and I think the explanation here is pretty much complacency. The country decided, the government decided, the people decided, oh, we're immune, the danger is exaggerated, COVID is not so harmful after all. So there is no need for lockdowns, no need to stay at home. And the summer was a pretty good period, not a lot of cases, but then this changed in September and October 2020. And then when it changed because of complacency, the government was much slower to respond. It only imposed another lockdown in November, and then it was too late because the pandemic was already raging. And then population was much less likely to comply. Interest groups started to complain and to protest, mostly hotels, restaurants, and cafes who felt that their businesses hurt very much for no good reason. And then in all this, it became clear that the government doesn't have a strategy. What became worse is that not only there was no strategy, but also there was no government after March 2021. The government resigned for unrelated reasons, and there was a new cabinet, caretaker cabinet, only in May. And this was a few crucial months in which the pandemic gained speed. It affected a lot of people. Another lockdown had to be imposed, a third one in May, but that was again too late, and it was only half-heartedly enforced. The population didn't bother to comply anymore, also because the signs from the government were not very clear. And perhaps the biggest failure was the vaccination campaign, which actually started pretty early, and there were talks of strategy already at the end of 2020, so there was not a delayed response, but somehow the ball was dropped, or there was not much the government to do in the face of a very, very vaccine hesitant population. And then the question is why there was no information campaign, but this just goes again to the systematic reasons of low government capacity to explain, coordinate, and implement its campaigns and decisions. So to draw the line, at the end of 2021, Bulgaria had one of the highest death tolls from the pandemic. So based on excess mortality or other measures, the country is near the top of the world in this very unfortunate ranking. It has the lowest or one of the lowest vaccination rates in Europe. Not much influence the decisions to vaccinate the people. The government almost entirely capitulated from managing the pandemic overall, also because in the political crisis there wasn't or there is no proper government since the spring of 2021. And disinformation rages not only on social media, where perhaps we're used to see that, but there were a lot of very dubious figures, including from the medical establishment, who promoted conspiracy theories, anti-vax theories on public traditional media, on TV. So just a graph to illustrate that I'm not making things up. You can see here that Bulgaria is second from the top on the global scale of excess mortality, at least according to the Financial Times data, where this graph comes from. Again, to the question why, some systematic causes, limited government capacity. Again, in the beginning, maybe it helped because countries are scared, so they reacted fast. But then later on, it definitely didn't help to have limited government capacity. Another point is, as other Eastern European countries, Bulgaria is very much used to when they have a policy, it's just command and control, authority-based restrictions. And these have limited effect, especially when they have to run for a long time. People perceive the restrictions as very heavy-handed. In the beginning, they complied, but later they complained. Why are the parks closed? Why I cannot go do shopping? They seem just unreasonable restrictions, not well explained, not well coordinated, which led to very low compliance with these measures. And then finally, especially when it comes to the vaccination campaigns, what really didn't help is the editor said that the region has a moderate level of trust in authorities. I think, especially in Bulgaria, it's not moderate, it's pathologically low. No matter what the numbers say, there is just a culture of distrusting government, but also the professions, medical doctors. If you look at the data, the country has some of the lowest levels of trust in any institutions, including hospitals, the medical profession. So in that environment, it's very hard to conduct any public health or vaccination campaign or anything, basically. So it puts important constraints on governance. This is the end of my presentation. These are just a couple of resources if you're interested to know more about these conclusions. The comparative data comes from a paper in the Journal of European Public Policy published last year. And then let me advertise a new Horizon project on COVID governance that just started a few months ago. It's called Legitimate, and it focuses on the impact of multi-level governance. We already have a website. There are actually two partners from Slovenia and from Croatia there in the project consortium. So I hope you're still interested in COVID governance and you're going to follow the output of this large project. And with that, I'll end. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy for any questions or reactions to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dimiter, for these fascinating insights. I can already see so many comparisons coming up with the various countries of Southeastern Europe. So the next presenter is Sergiu Gherghina from the University of Glasgow, who's going to talk to us about his chapter in Romania. So we're obviously, as it's an academic event, running slightly behind with time. So I will kindly ask the next three presenters, including myself, to be as concise as possible in order to leave some time for the Q&A. So Sergiu, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I hope you can hear me. It's going to be short because Dimiter has already covered quite a lot of what I wanted to say. It's not by accident that Bulgaria and Romania are often considered in the same group when referring to reactions, attitudes, behaviors in the EU and not only. So I'm not going to repeat many of the things that he said. I'm just going to try and outline what has been different in Romania. So not surprisingly, the title captures what happened in this policy, in this case, but it's applicable to many policy areas and to many domains of the public life when it comes to governance in Romania. The paper is co-authored with Sebastian, who couldn't be with us, unfortunately, today, and hopefully he will back me up on everything I say. So there are four phases of the crisis, very similar to the first is very similar to what Dimiter mentioned, but considered mainly a success. It was a state of emergency declared mid-March 2020 with many restrictive measures, including a lockdown, curfew, and all the other things that have been quite common in many countries. This has been the only phase in which the authority of the state and the policy reactions have been uncontested. Basically, everybody was on board. Then the second stage started in mid-May, where the state of emergency was removed and replaced by the state of alert with lower severity of measures, more targeted in general. And this was a period in which still people were on board and opposition parties and everyone else was quite okay. However, by November 2020, when there was reintroduced a partial lockdown and a reaction to a second wave throughout Europe, problems started to occur. So that was the moment when many things that initially made sense, including the cooptation of experts in the decision-making process, started collapsing. So between March and November, many things were in place, very similar to what Dimiter mentioned for Bulgaria. Then February 2021, there is a gradual reopening, lifting restrictions, contestation of vaccination, and things faded away. In that sense, understanding the whole process in the country is important to take into account three layers. It's actually two layers of governance and experts that were feeding in both at central and local level, more at central level, and especially in the first phase of the pandemic. So at central level, there is a directly elected president who becomes visible usually in times of crisis. The government and the parliament synchronized to a certain extent, more or less until October, November 2020. And then there were the special committees assembled for crisis management, health-related issues, that sort of thing, security, national security, and all that. At local level, there are the political authorities, but also the medical authorities. Apologies for the topic, for the typo there. So it is important to understand that the local authorities had quite a word to say on how to implement the guidelines that were sent from the central level. Also because there were discrepancies between the contamination rate and the deaths in the territory. The country is divided into counties, 41 plus the capital city, and there were massive discrepancies. So towards the western border, central and western border, there were fewer cases than in the south and in the east for various reasons. Then the situation changed. Counties with major cities had more contaminations, counties with smaller cities, fewer contaminations, usual mobility thing. And then the third element that played a role was the experts. Their role was important for the first phase in terms of policy implementation, but then some of these experts starting being vocal also in the second or third phase of the pandemic, especially criticizing and fueling some conspiracy theories. Different type of experts were doing this sort of thing. Politicization, indeed, as the editors mentioned, it was not big. However, there was a lot of discussion, a lot of speculation, which is quite symptomatic for the Romanian society, in which everybody has opinions about almost everything and everybody else. So most measures were contested, highly debated and challenged by political and societal actors. Political actors in opposition, they rarely did political things to actually politicize this element, but very often there were groups of citizens ad hoc united or fueled by politicians in opposition or by the church. The church took a very strong stance against the entire pandemic discourse. The only short period of time without much debate was already covered March, May 2020. And the problem was that there were many changes to the rules and provisions that caused high levels of public frustration. And those changes were determined by three factors. First, the government did not have a clear strategy about how to handle this, and very much was mimetism. So they were taking from other governments what they thought would work without actually adapting it properly to the case. The second reason for which they had many changes to the rules of provisions was exactly this contestation. They started reacting to contestation, and then the entire process of decision making started losing its coherence and consistency. And the third reason behind this was that the voices of those supporting some policy reactions, the voices that supported initially the policy reactions, started being more and more heterogeneous for various reasons. And then things starting getting problematic. The level of contestation targeted a few major decisions. So for initially the decisions of the Ministry of Health regarding hospitalization, that was a major issue, although the reactions of the Romanian government were coherent and consistent with the low capacity that Dimiter mentioned. There were problems related to decisions of hospitalization. Who should get hospitalized? What are the criteria? How that happens? Later, there were discussions about vaccination, how it just happened, what is the fairness of access, conspiracy theories with all the microchips, Microsoft, everything that you know that circulated in the area was present in Romania. So what happened, I mean, is not surprising that as this wave of contestation plagued the country had the second lowest vaccination rate in the EU. Roughly 1/4 of the population was vaccinated. Now, most people blame in the country, and the government very often blamed a party, a small opposition party, which has 10% support, is a radical right party, with a nationalist party, but it has an overrated importance. It was indeed very vocal in the anti-restriction protests. It mobilized a couple of thousand people, but that's pretty much nothing compared to the population. But the problem was that due to the fact that much of the discussion centered around the action of this party and what it did with its anti-vaccine rhetoric, by October 2021, many question marks started emerging about the response to the pandemic. So in practice, this party, if you look at the action, did not do much. But the repercussions, the rhetoric repercussions were quite big, because much of the discourse referred to the party. Now, briefly about the policy responses, I'm not going to insist on what has been already covered. In the first phase, things were coherent, influenced by low preparedness and capacity of the medical system to address the pandemic. The public-private partnership helped overcome the initial vulnerabilities, but many of these things were ad hoc. There was no systematic partnership in place, as it has been shown by previous studies on the topic. And as in terms of policy responses, the public information campaigns were useful for a while, but also masked election campaign funding. So basically the government, instead of promoting itself and what it did, it gave a lot of money to the newspapers and to the media outlets to basically promote the anti-COVID campaign, but in a sense, it was masked campaign for itself, and then this triggered quite a bit of protest from opposition actors and other groups. Now, what were the major problematic responses? First was education. Although it could have been, it was a good decision to close down the schools, the government did not make sure that there are conditions to carry out teaching. So they emphasized to carry teaching online, but there are still areas of the countries where electricity is problematic. They don't have electricity on a regular basis. They don't have Wi-Fi, bandwidth is problematic, all that. They invested money in buying laptops and tablets to some areas, but they ended up buying laptops and tablets in areas that don't have internet coverage or electricity. So there were quite a few of these problems revealed in the media, and many of the decisions regarding educations were ad hoc. They reopened the school, they closed the school, they reopened again. Some counties opened the schools, others closed, depending on the green. They used the traffic light system. So it was a complete chaos by the end of the pandemic. And then there was also a problem with the freedom of movement, because it was often limited in this period, and the country used the county level approach that created confusion. So for example, if one person lived in the capital city but then went on business in the second largest city of the country, then they often did not know what regulations apply in that city unless they had to inform themselves solid before traveling, because these things were a bit confusing after half a year. In the first half a year, everything was sort of unitary, but then it was a problem. Now, what are the key conclusions? There was a disempowerment of experts after the first phase, which was a problem in terms of keeping the policy response coherent and cohesive. There was a lot of action inconsistency triggered by the elements that I mentioned, and there was limited predictability of policies. Many were mimetic with little adjustment to the context, so that the government gave the feeling that they are afraid of taking decisions on their own, not being criticized, but when they take decisions that have been taken by other countries, they can easily say, yes, look, the German government does the same time. So the basic thing is that there was no visible policy strategy, but it was quite firefighting oriented. That's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sergiu. We're now moving westwards towards Slovenia, and we're pleased to have Danica Fink-Hafner here today. And I should also say that it's a double celebration. It's a book launch, but also Danica's birthday today. So happy birthday, Danica, and thank you so much for being with us.
I will tell you it's 64, so that you won't be curious.
Well,
I'm proud of my 64.
That is much better than some of our governments in terms of COVID policy. So thank you.
Well, yeah, we'll see.
Transparency and integrity. Then happy birthday once again. And yes, so please tell us about Slovenians' COVID response. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. In the morning, when I looked at the book again, I found at the beginning of the book that idea of the book is actually looking at how COVID-19 fundamentally tested political institutions, political process, and public policies. So actually, I prepared my contribution based on this, while I would like to add an additional stress on actors. And later on, you will see why I did that. So secondly, I should say that in Slovenia, managing of the pandemic was highly politicized, mostly because it was directly linked to a radical decline in democracy in Slovenia under the new government led by Slovenian Democratic Party. Janez Janša is the leader. The government was not formed based on elections, but rather because of stepping down of the previous center-left government, which was very weak. So thirdly, if I go directly to political institutions, here I think it is important to stress that it is not only about institutions during the COVID, but also how political institutions functioned already prior to COVID. And I think this is critical to understand why political parties, particularly also parties in the parliament, and this also makes the parliament very weak, is linked to the phenomena started in Slovenia shortly after the joining of the EU, namely, we have been facing with problems of political representation much earlier on, and numerous early elections and new governments have been formed by completely new political parties entering not the parliament, but also the executive at the same time. So it's also about the weakness of police autonomy, where politics could step in and change the head of the police. Similarly comes with the army autonomy, the autonomy of public administration, meaning bureaucrats that could be easily replaced when governments are changed, and so on. What is a positive thing with regard to the characteristics of Slovenian institutions is that not only the executive has been strong, but also a rather strong opposition or controller of the executive has been judiciary, particularly constitutional court, which has been used also by civil society actors. So I would stress here the weaknesses of government capacities, but linked directly to problems with political representation. If I move forward with political process, I think it is critical to say that the new mode of governing was actually governing by decree without the basis in law. It was also a dismissal of social partnership, which in Slovenia has been actually an institution with very long historical roots. It was the exclusion of NGOs from a policy process, the very selective use of experts, so this was all very much politicized. At the same time, the power concentrated around the prime minister, so it was not only that it was the center-right government under the leadership of the Prime Minister Janša. It was also about submitting other coalition partners to what was the main politics led by Janša. So actually they have been disappearing, and currently they are not really important actors anymore. Beside that, I would also like to stress that political process has become very much influenced by hate speech provided by government, particularly by leaders of the governing party via Twitter. This was echoed in the mass media. So all these things have been linked together with massive replacement of cadre in various parts of political institutions, and even state-owned or co-owned enterprises. This was also linked with diminishing the roots of financial support for the national public TV and public press company. So if I move forward to public policies, even in part, they have been introduced to manage COVID pandemic. The problem was very low and declining trust in government, and this has been proved by sociologists, our researchers, to be a critical factor in not following the policies created by the government. So implementation was very poor. Beside that, it was linked with a severe reduction of civil liberties and rights. Then also mistrust was created by including anti-COVID measures into packages with other laws that actually undermine the political system and freedom of mass media. In terms of managing COVID, it was also important that the hierarchy of values was rather strange with regard to Slovenian values. Namely, the priority was given to economy over taking care of marginal groups. And altogether was even topped by the use of physical repression of the police that haven't been seen in Slovenia, not even in socialist times. So if I just move to my additional stress, it's actors. I think Slovenia is quite different with regard to post-socialist countries, at least many of them, because of the strength of civil society, which has developed or rised enormously, and not only through protests, but also with other modes of action. They actually empowered the poor political opposition in the parliament. The whole big movement that evolved actually produced a new political party that gained elections at the end of the COVID period. And now we have a center-left government with the values declared as they are in our constitution, and they were already before the Janša's government. I will not go further into details due to the time limit, but I would like just to conclude that, of course, there are many groupings possible when we look at certain phenomena. If we took into account other kinds of variables like the strength of social partnership, the kind of welfare state, the kind of the type of transition and socioeconomic conditions and so on, Slovenia would probably join another kind of grouping, not like as it has been proposed by now. Just as an illustration, when we had a project on managing EU affairs, Slovenia was much closer to Finland than to Estonia, for example. We were the only two post-socialist countries. So I would like to thank all the participants for producing this information, and I believe that there is plenty of more to explore based on this data and perhaps adding different views. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Danica. It was very useful to stress that the book in itself really, as you said, tests. All papers are testing the governances wherever they are in the Europe, and those shifts that you made with asking about the contaminating practices. What is it that contaminates the public health as such in each country is very relevant. Tena, please, the floor is yours. Don't worry about the timing. You have your time to present the Croatian case, and we will still have minutes and time enough to launch the discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sanja. So the chapter on Croatia that I'm going to be presented has been written in co-authorship with Sanja, who is an associate professor at the University of Rijeka and the director of the Center of Advanced Studies in Southeastern Europe. And a large part of the work on the chapter has been produced while I was a fellow at SAS. So it's indeed a great pleasure to be hosting this event today. Our main argument, you can see it very well reflected in the title. It's which is called Croatia Breaking Fragile Trust. And without going into the details of Croatia's COVID response, I would like to take you through our main argument and explain why we think this has been so during the COVID pandemic in Croatia and with what consequences. So very much in line with what we've heard about Bulgaria and Romania, especially, the early response of Croatia was very good, very decisive. Key characteristics were a very centralized approach and very much aligned with what all the EU rules and regulations were. And it was an approach that was led widely by the executive and by the Prime Minister himself, Andrej Plenković. There was the main institution that was in charge of the COVID response, were the National Headquarters of Civil Protection, in shorthand, the Stožer. So this is the word that I will use during this presentation. And it's interesting that although it was centralized at the beginning, we did have institutions that were also active at regional, city, and municipal levels. So basically, Stožers were also present at the lower levels of administration. And the general rule was that the lower level Stožers could apply stricter rules, but not less strict rules than the higher level ones. So, for instance, if I don't know, the city of Rijeka or the region of the Rijeka region, Primorsko-Goranska Županija, wanted to implement stricter rules than the national ones, they could have done it, but not vice versa. One thing that complicated a lot the early response was the fragmentation of local administrative units. This response was, as said, decisive. You had, a lot of restrictions also of movement at the beginning. Well, Croatia is divided in as many as 576 self-government units at local and regional level. And that made it very difficult for some people, for instance, even to go to a pharmacy or to, access cash at an ATM. So these were some of the reasons why, this full closure of the beginning was became unsustainable very soon. The initial response from the population was as well very much in line with what we heard before, meaning that there was a complete acceptance of the fact that it was an emergency situation. I would say also that it's likely that the relatively recent experience of Croatia with conflict and war was a reason why people just had this mindset kicking in. Okay, we can do this. It's an emergency. Let's all stick together and let's fall in line with what the government is telling us and what the media are telling us. So at the beginning, you had a complete sort of also alignment of the mainstream media with what the decisions of the government were. And it's very interesting that so at the beginning, you have this trust in government and institutions, which is traditionally very low also in Croatia, that rises significantly. So it's a rise of about even 20 to 30% in the first couple of months for these reasons. And the decisions at the beginning are not questioned. So this decisive response also creates new heroes and role models. So this Stožer, the national headquarters, had members that were taken from both, politics. So the Minister of Health was part of it, and experts. And such was, the sort of, trust that it communicated to people that really they were hailed as role models at the beginning. You can see here kids making, cartoons that were depicting them. A girl decided that there was no woman on the Croatian banknotes and therefore put Alenka Markotić, you can see it here in the lower right corner, on a fictional banknote. And yet, soon enough, you had controversies, and those same heroes became very, very controversial and compromised individuals. These are just some examples. So the same Alenka Markotić, who was a superhero in the previous slide, attended herself a religious event in the center of Zagreb with very many people, as you can see here, and spoke at it. So that was the first moment in which one of those moments in which people in Croatia said, oh, well, maybe these rules that they're imposing on us are not the same for everybody. There was another episode in which she, as well as a lot of other prominent people, arranged for either themselves or their relatives to jump the vaccination queue. Another, former hero, the Minister of Health, Vili Beros, who was, yes, a HDZ member, so HDZ is the ruling party, but was very much hailed as an expert and as an individual who was super partes. He had just taken his role as a Minister of Health 2 months before the start of the pandemic, and he's a neurosurgeon, so he was very, very much well seen at the beginning. And then soon enough, at the early elections held in Croatia in summer 2020, he was touted as the leading candidate for the HDZ in the Zagreb circumscription. So there, people start saying, oh, wait, are they, those experts that we are supposed to trust? Or are they just falling in line with whatever the government, whatever the ruling party is telling them in order to gain basically advantages for themselves and in order to proceed in their careers? But this is not everything. The biggest problem was probably about, politicians and their various privileges and even issues of corruption. So while people were confined in their houses and could not travel, could not meet anybody, it emerged that politicians, business managers, and other powerful individuals were meeting in a club, which was said to be a non-club, because it was not a club that was a club, in the center of Zagreb. To make things worse, it was owned by a manager of, a director of Janaf, an energy company, who was very soon enough implicated in an investigation on rigged tenders and bribery that, by the way, was also touted to have happened, some of it in this specific club, in this bar. So you can see how the fact that people, including the president and other politicians attended this, how this dented the trust that was gained among the population. This is another huge scandal that occurred in that period that involved also messages exchanged with an assistant of the prime minister. At the same time, what happened in this early period, so before summer 2020, was that after 2 months of, very, very decisive lockdown, 2 up to 3 months, there was already an early reopening. This was done by the government in order to save the tourist season, which is an absolute key feature of Croatia's economy. According to different types of estimates, tourism makes up to 1/3 of Croatia's GDP when you take everything into account. So that was very important, economically. And of course, it was very important also in order to keep social peace, because a lot of people, and therefore voters, are dependent on tourism. So you can see here how basically the tourist nights, the amount of tourists has gone down until April, but then from May onwards, you can see how it actually goes up, and Croatia ends up not losing so much. So you can see from this second graph, these are countries that are highly dependent on tourism within the European Union: Spain, Cyprus, Portugal, Malta, Greece, Italy, and Croatia. Croatia is the last one, the one with the red bar. And you can see that Croatia has actually lost least in terms of tourism income in 2020. So that was again for the government, both in economic terms and in terms, as I said, of popularity. So what happens that in July 2020, we had early elections. Elections were supposed to take place in the autumn, but the prime minister and the ruling party makes a very good call for them, which is to call early elections, and is therefore able to capitalize on its early good handling of the pandemic. Although, as I explained already, by the summer, you have these controversies, you have first loss of trust, and so on and so forth. But you can see from these results that so the key features of these elections were a very low turnout by Croatian standards, which is not high anyway, but it was even lower this time, of course, due to also COVID uncertainties and problems. You can see, the second important point is that although, mainstream media in the West were making a lot of this far-right scare, this actually did not materialize. So the Homeland movement, this far-right party, did not manage to get a big amount of their MPs elected. And that allowed for the HDZ to return a really decisive victory. So basically, they needed no coalition partners. And this is really important because from July 2020 until 2024, so we're still in this period in which the ruling party basically managed to get for themselves free rein. They had really the autonomy to make most decisions without without being in a coalition, without really having to consult anybody else. Vaccination is a mixed story. So it had a slow start, as actually it had a slow start everywhere in the EU. If you remember the discussions at that point, there was this other interesting phenomenon that at the very beginning of the vaccination, saga, some Croatians went to get the Sinopharm vaccine in Serbia, where it was made available much earlier. So Serbia had this interesting, geopolitical also positioning during the COVID pandemic, in which its relations with China were much strengthened, and also with Russia. So they had a lot of availability of vaccines at the beginning, making it seem so that the EU was underperforming. But actually, I have to say, I was in Croatia at the time. I got vaccinated here. The implementation, when it started, it was solid. You could get access to vaccines quite easily, depending on your age. And quite soon, the problem switched from one of supply to one of demand, as we've seen also in the case of other countries. Vaccine hesitancy, perhaps also linked somehow to this general loss of trust and conflicting information, was high. So to date, we have 55% of the population that is fully vaccinated. That is not so great. And you can see in the map that there are, of course, regional differences here as well. So what happened at the end of the day in the terms of distrust that skyrocketed in institutions in early 2020? Well, towards December 2020, so towards the beginning of the second wave, let's say, you can see that in line with, I would say, probably a lot of other countries, family and friends are very trusted. And also interestingly, and I find this an encouraging point, that in Croatia, experts and scientists are also quite highly trusted, despite all the controversies that surrounded it during the pandemic. But by then, so half a year later, only 20% were happy with the government's work, which is, a huge drop from the spring 2020. And only 12% were happy with the parliament's work. So the key takeaways of our chapter is that, first of all, so the executive smart management of this early phase of the pandemic, combined with this, scheme of the early elections, has really ensured them this control over the country and sort of free reign in this period from 2020 to 2024. And you can see, if you're following Croatian politics a little bit, how this free reign has also allowed more autocratic waves of governance, I would say, and increasingly, just shutting down any criticism, not responding to the media, saying the themes are the themes that I decide are themes. Yeah, so these are things that we've heard from our prime minister in the last few days. So at the same time, while the smart management of the early phase has won them the control over the country, it has also lost them, in part at least, the trust of the citizens. Again, meaning it was not high before, but it's low now again. Then third point, this is a more overarching point, but you've seen how these corruption scandals have been following throughout, the pandemic, and also before these elections, and we have new ones now. And in a way, there's this question of whether, the public has been completely vaccinated against them and keeps voting for the devil they know, despite them. I find it encouraging, once again, that despite this widespread criticism and less than perfect basically management, Croats still believe in science. So that might be, something that is better as compared to the neighbors, the Western Balkan countries. And yet, what we argue is that throughout this process, throughout this, loss of trust, throughout this situation in which people were disillusioned, and you had protests, and you had a situation in which there is this, feeling that there is nothing to believe in anymore, that there was, you could see the profiling and the consolidation really of a populist niche of the public that can be exploited by some political actors who present themselves, as just calling it out as it is. So we're not the experts, we're just telling you things straight out in the face. This is embodied, in my view, by the current president, Zoran Milanovic, but there are other, political parties and actors that have run it. And you can see this sort of mix of, the anti-EU rhetoric, so because the pro-EU position was very much embodied by the government, and of various, conspiracy theories, perhaps pro-Russian messaging, and just anti-system sentiments that are combined, and that, in our view, during the pandemic was a moment in which this was consolidated, and now you can see it sort of running through Croatian politics to the present day. So thank you very much. I hope we have some time for Q&A, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you very much, Tena. I liked very much all these presentations, and it gave us a span of differences between Bulgaria, Romania, Slovenia, and Croatia. But overall impression that I had is just COVID and the rule of law. What is there? How that balance is very dangerous. How to react, how to act during a crisis. Now we call it pan crisis. We are now in a period of multiple crises layered in their importance. How that was controlled, and then not only controlled, but then contaminated by certain aspects of reaction. So please, firstly, I invite you to react among yourself, the presenters, and I invite our public, our auditors, if they have any question concretely. Even their comments or suggestions are most welcome. Maybe our editors as well have a comment on current presentations, because things in the meantime have changed, at least in Slovenia, drastically with the governing bodies nowadays shifted into a direction that maybe Danica can tell us more about. Yes, Danica, please.
Yeah.
I think Kennet was first.
I forgot to put, I just put my hand up like this. I see there's a thing here at the bottom. Oh, I'll just be quick. I mean, a couple of you mentioned the role of the church as an institution and religion. I don't know if you could say a little more about it, if it does have any role at all, because that's the kind of thing we haven't sort of gone into in a systematic way in the book, but we did obviously notice that there was a couple of or a number of chapters where it did play a role in some countries.
Perhaps a quick reaction from my side, because I was interested in seeing that the church actually has a very low level of trust among the Croatian public. So in other words, it is a very powerful institution, but the public does not trust it. Definitely not, in a situation of pandemic, but also more generally. So it seems to me that perhaps it was bundled by the public also within this, element of powerful institutions, and that the trust trust towards it was low. So in other words, I don't think it played really a role in the, in leading in terms of the COVID response and COVID policies in Croatia, at least.
Sergiu, and then we will head to Danica, because Danica can also respond to Kennet's remark.
Yes. Well, I will start with the last one because we already heard the comments from Tena. I would also say that the main church, the Catholic Church in Slovenia, probably has not changed its relations with being closer to Janša's party during the COVID. At the same time, it was not a very active promoter of any particular activity, while Caritas actually was accepted very well in public, together with the Red Cross, in terms of helping people in need during the COVID, when they didn't have access to certain things, they helped elderly and so on. But with regard to the rule of law, I think that at least in Slovenia, it has showed that the rule of law is not only about institutions, it is very much about individuals who are active, who are part of these institutions. So some people in public administration, for example, just do what they are told, or they try to be passive in their negative response. But there were also some individuals who came out in public. We had a very well-received, publicly received whistleblower, but unfortunately he lost his job. At the same time, we also had very brave jurists, very brave individual journalists. So I think it is important to remember again, the basics of liberal democracy. It's not about institutions, it's also about values, it's also about professional autonomy and things like that. So after 30 years of transitions to democracy, I think we are now, at least in post-socialist countries, we are now back to having more serious thoughts and activities with regard to strengthen the basic consensus on liberal values. I think something similar is even happening in some Western countries, like, for example, in the USA. Liberal values are not automatic. So I think for the rule of law, it was not only important in Slovenia that we had the constitutional court that stick with the constitution. We also had important support by civil society actors to such behavior, and we also had a direct support from the EU via professional linkages of these people from Slovenia, and they got support, public support or pressure by international institutions who criticized measures by the government who went against the rule of law, damaging journalism and so on, or judiciary. At the same time, we also had more proactive EU, particularly European Parliament behavior than we had faced earlier in case of Hungary and Poland. I think Slovenia became a kind of example where European institutions started thinking that democracy is not automatic, even in the case of Slovenia, where everybody thought, it was a consolidated democracy and full stop. The EU needs to perhaps be more, let's say, intrusive or protective in circumstances where democracy is in danger in a member state. So these are my thoughts.
Thank you, Danica. Before Dimiter, it was Sergiu, please.
Just a quick note on, I think it was Kennet who mentioned the role of church. In Romania, it was one of the largest contesters of the entire policy reaction of the government, and it was the most vocal because all the restrictions affected their daily activities. Obviously, they could not do things online. They started doing them online after a few months, but the initial reaction was quite severe. The churches used to be very trusted. Right now, they're visible. The trust is a bit shaken down by some scandals, but still is one of the most trusted institutions in the country. And similarly to what Dimiter mentioned for Bulgaria, political parties, political authorities have levels of trust up to 20%. Church usually has it higher than 60%. So it's a huge difference between them. So in line with that, the strong ties between the church and this radical right party that promotes faith, religion, family as the traditional unit of society, that has led to a general impression that the church and the party are actually stronger than they used to be in the entire process.
Thank you. Dimiter, please.
Yeah, thank you. On the church issue, I think in Bulgaria it played no role whatsoever. Of course, in the beginning they complained that they cannot hold services, especially around Easter, but it was very quickly solved. So, but I want to talk about something else, and the format of this meeting encourages us to find unique experiences in Eastern Europe and emphasize how different they are, perhaps from patterns everywhere. But I think this is not really the case because, I mean, maybe there are differences of degree, but not really differences in kind. Because it was not only Eastern European countries that adopted emergency measures, this happened everywhere, almost everywhere. It's not only in Eastern Europe that executives were empowered over parliaments. Parliaments were quite quiet almost in all European countries and beyond. I also find the connection between rule of law erosion and COVID a little bit overblown because yes, there were emergency measures, but they were discontinued quite fast when they were not needed anymore. And I mean, it was a crisis situation. So, I mean, emergency measures exist as a possibility for a reason. They could have been abused, they could have been perhaps shorter or different, but at the end of the day, it's not a tail sign of the collapse of democracy in these countries because in the middle of a pandemic, they empowered the executive and had some emergency measures that bypassed parliament. Actually, parliament had a lot of instruments that they didn't use in order to help with the management of the pandemic. There were corruption scandals in Western Europe as well. There were a lot of people going to parties when they should not have been in the UK as well. So in a sense, it's variations on a theme and perhaps it's on a different scale, but I think it's important to emphasize that these countries are not on a different planet than the rest of Europe in terms of how governance works and how COVID was managed. It's perhaps a bit peculiar, but altogether variations on a theme.
Thanks a lot, Dimiter, for enlarging the perspective. Mads, yes, the floor is yours. And Kennet, we will not overrun the closure, so we still have some time, and I hope you will stay with us. Mads, please.
Yeah, but Dimiter just took my point, so I'm going to echo what he just said, because when we look across all the chapters, we do not find evidence for democratic backsliding. We might see power grabs of governments in the short run, but actually we are ending on a positive note that democracies in Europe are kind of resilient. We see slowly that parliaments and courts and other institutions and actors are coming back into the political process through the course of the pandemic. So we actually see that the political institutions are quite resilient, and we don't see any particular backsliding. So this is actually quite positive.
Thank you, Mads. We are now at the end of the event, but it's not the end because we are going to promote the book in another environments, online environments. So I'm inviting you all to our next presentation, and our editors will keep us in the loop about any further promotion. I encourage you all to read the book. Maybe there will be some room for follow-up on the book and on the subject. Thank you very much for your participation. The recording will be available. If there were any objections, we will not put it online, but I don't think there were any sensitive information shared. Again, thank you, and looking forward to our next presentation, book launch presentation. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for
Thank you so much
organizing
for
this.
organizing it.
Yeah.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Bye.